Yo, it's Oliver here, and today we're talking about a royal guard, interrupted Donald Trump in the middle of a speech, or walked straight up and handed the US president a sealed envelope. When Trump opened it, there was a medal, a faded photo, and a handwritten letter from a Wu soldier claiming something that caught everyone off guard. Whatever it said, for the first time in a long time, Trump didn't have a single word to say. Now, before we reveal the contents of that letter, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. So let's get into it. You know those buildings in London that don't just hold events, they hold centuries. Carlton House Terrace is one of them. White stone that's seen kings and prime ministers come and go. Tall windows that have watched history unfold. And this particular kind of British dignity that makes even the loudest visitors lower their voices just a little. The place has weight, not just architectural weight, though those marble columns could probably hold up a cathedral, but the kind of emotional gravity that comes from hosting conversations that changed the world. Churchill walked these halls. Roosevelt sat in these chairs. Treaties were signed on tables that are probably worth more than most people's houses. Today, though, the usual quiet had been replaced with something different. The grand interior hall, normally reserved for the kind of meetings they don't put on the evening news, had been transformed into something between a ceremony and a reunion. The air smelled faintly of old wood and fresh flowers, with just a hint of that particular British mustiness that comes from buildings that remember everything they've witnessed. Two flags stood at attention at the far end. The Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes side by side like old friends who'd been through too much together to need small talk. Rows of chairs filled with military dress uniforms. British commanders with silver hair that caught the chandelier light. US generals wearing ribbons that told stories they'd probably never share at dinner parties. And scattered among them the real reason everyone was here. Wheelchairs, walking sticks, hands that shook just slightly as they gripped programs, the old guard, the ones who were there when it mattered most. At the front, a lectern bearing the seal of the President of the United States, and behind it, Donald Trump. Now at 79, Trump still carried himself like a man who expected the room to lean in when he spoke. Navy suit pressed to perfection. That signature red tie catching the light, scanning the crowd with a kind of confidence that comes from decades of assuming people want to hear what you have to say. But here's what nobody in that room noticed. Not the cameras, not the diplomats, not even the Secret Service agents positioned along the walls. Toward the back, standing near one of those massive marble columns like he was part of the architecture itself, was a figure in crimson. Warrant Officer Callum Reev, 39 years old, Coldstream Guard. If you've ever seen one of these guards up close, you know they don't just wear the uniform, they inhabit it. Every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Every button polished to mirror brightness. Standing with a kind of stillness that makes you wonder if they even breathe. But Callum wasn't just any ceremonial guard. This man had seen Iraq when it was still smoking, Cyprus during the Troubles, 2 UN postings in places that didn't make the news because admitting they needed peacekeepers would have been admitting too much. He'd learned a different kind of stillness. Not the theatrical kind, but the kind that keeps you alive when everything around you is falling apart. He wasn't supposed to move today. His job was simple. Stand there, look official, make sure nobody got too close to anything important, except Callum Reev was holding something beneath his perfectly pressed tunic. A thin envelope slightly worn at the edges, sealed with burgundy wax. The initials fast-scrolled in black ink by a hand that had probably been shaking when it wrote them. 2 days earlier, Callum had been visiting a hospice in Surrey. Not official business, just a favour for an old regimental friend who'd asked him to check on someone. These visits happened more often than you'd think. Old soldiers looking after older soldiers, the kind of duty that doesn't come with medals. The hospice was one of those places that tries very hard to feel like home, but can't quite hide the fact that people come there to die. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, family photos on every bedside table, staff who speak in gentle voices and move like they're walking through a library. The man in the bed was Sergeant Francis Alden, 96 years old, lungs failing, but eyes still sharp as broken glass. Normandy veteran, June 1944. The kind of man who'd seen history up close and personal. When Callum walked into the room, Alden was sitting up, despite the oxygen tubes, studying a small wooden box on his lap, like it contained state secrets. His hands shook not from fear, but from the simple reality of a body that had carried him through nearly a century and was finally wearing out. "You're the Coldstream boy?" Alden asked, his voice rough as sandpaper, but surprisingly strong. "Yes, sir. Warrant Officer Reev." Alden nodded, satisfied. "Good, good. I need someone who understands promises." He opened the box with careful fingers, revealing the envelope that would change everything. The wax seal caught the afternoon light filtering through the hospice window, burgundy red, pressed with what looked like a signet ring. "Been carrying this for 79 years, Alden whispered. "Longer than you've been alive, son. Longer than most people get to live at all." As Alden took what would turn out to be his last conscious breath, he grabbed Callum's wrist with surprising strength and pressed that envelope into his palm. His grip was surprisingly firm for someone so frail, the kind of grasp that comes from a lifetime of holding on to important things. "Give this to the man who never knew," he whispered, his eyes boring into Callum's with an intensity that made the younger man understand this wasn't a request. It was a sacred charge. Callum had promised nothing dramatic. Just a simple nod from one soldier to another, the kind of promise you make when you understand that some things are bigger than convenience, bigger than protocol, bigger than your own comfort. He didn't expect it to matter. He certainly didn't expect it to happen today, but as Trump adjusted the microphone and launched into his opening remarks, something shifted in that hall. Something you couldn't see or hear, but every person with any military training felt it in their bones. Callum's fingers tightened around that envelope, and somehow he knew today was the day. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump began, his voice carrying that familiar blend of authority and showmanship. "We gather today not as Republicans or Democrats, not as Americans or Brits, but as the sons and daughters of sacrifice." The crowd responded with respectful attention. A few nods from the front row where the American veterans sat. Someone cleared their throat. The kind of polite, formal response you get when people know they're supposed to be moved but aren't quite there yet. Trump found his rhythm quickly. Half rally speech, half memorial service. He praised the unbreakable bond between the two nations. Talked about beaches where freedom itself had to be fought for with blood and sand. Gestured toward the elderly veterans with just the right amount of reverence. Standard stuff. Well delivered, properly respectful, exactly what everyone expected to hear. But 20 m back, just behind the last row of British officers, something was happening that nobody had planned for. Warrant Officer Callum Reev took a step forward. Not a big step, not dramatic, just one polished boot in front of the other, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of knowing exactly where your feet are supposed to go. Then, another step. His boot struck the marble floor with that distinctive sound military people recognize instantly. Click, 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 click. Barely audible over Trump's voice, but unmistakable if you knew what to listen for. A photographer near the sidewall lowered her camera, confused. A diplomatic aide glanced over, frowned slightly. Because here's the thing about royal guards. They don't move. That's literally the point. They stand where they're posted, and they stay there until someone in authority tells them otherwise. But Callum wasn't responding to orders. His face showed no urgency, no alarm. This wasn't about security or protocol. He reached inside his tunic with one white-gloved hand and pulled out the envelope. Under the chandelier light, that burgundy wax seal caught the glow like a tiny flame. Two British aides in the third row exchanged glances. Is he supposed to be doing that? Royal guards don't just walk around during ceremonies. Should we? But before anyone could decide what to do, Callum had cleared the final row of chairs and now stood perfectly upright, envelope in hand, 6 paces from the raised platform where Trump was speaking. Trump caught the movement in his peripheral vision, and his voice trailed off mid-sentence. He'd been saying something about quiet partnerships across generations when he looked up and saw the man in red. For a moment, he just stared. This wasn't in the program. His security briefing hadn't mentioned anything about interactive elements or ceremonial presentations. He leaned forward over the microphone, that familiar expression of mild irritation crossing his face. What's this? A Secret Service agent near the wall tensed, hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. But then he paused. The guard wasn't aggressive, wasn't making any threatening moves. He was just standing there holding an envelope, looking like he had something important to say. Callum's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet room, not loud, but with the kind of projection that comes from years of needing to be heard over artillery. Serbs instructed to deliver this to you personally. From Sergeant Francis Alden, Normandy, June 1944. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. Trump's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. He straightened up, adjusted his tie unconsciously. Francis Alden. Callum extended the envelope, still maintaining perfect military posture. He passed 2 days ago, sir. This was his final request. Complete silence. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. Even the catering staff in the back had stopped moving. Forks and knives that had been clinking softly against plates went still. Everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something unplanned, unrehearsed, and probably more important than anything on the official agenda. Trump hesitated. You could see him calculating. Who was this guy? What was in the envelope? Was this some kind of setup? But something in Callum's bearing, in the absolute sincerity of his posture, made the decision for him. He stepped down from the lectern and took the envelope. Callum didn't move a muscle, didn't nod or smile or show any emotion at all, just stood there like he was carved from the same marble as the columns. Trump stared at the wax seal, turning the envelope over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, not just physically, but in some way that had nothing to do with weight. You're serious about this? He asked quietly. Callum gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as silently as he had approached, he executed a perfect about-face and walked back to his post along the wall. Duty completed. Mission accomplished. Trump was left standing alone at the front of the room, holding an envelope from a war he'd never fought in, from a man whose name he didn't recognize. The microphone was still live. 200 people were still watching, but nobody said a word. Trump stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, the kind of pause that feels enormous when you're in it. His thumb traced the edge of the wax seal, feeling the slight imperfections where it had been pressed by a hand that probably wasn't quite steady anymore. You could see him wrestling with it. Open it now in front of everyone. Wait until later. What if it was something embarrassing or inappropriate? But there was something about the weight of it, the formality of the wax seal, the way that guard had delivered it with such solemn precision. He broke the seal. It cracked with a sound that somehow carried across the entire hall, sharp final, like a door closing on one era and opening on another. Inside were 3 items, a small bronze service star, tarnished with age, but still solid. The kind of medal they gave for actions that weren't quite heroic enough for the big ribbons, but were too important to go unrecognized. A black and white photograph with soft edges from decades of handling. The kind of careful where that comes from being looked at thousands of times and a single sheet of paper covered in thick, deliberate handwriting. The kind produced by someone who'd learned to write with fountain pens and had never quite adjusted to ballpoints. Trump pulled out the photograph first, handling it like it might dissolve under his fingers. 2 young men, probably early 20s, leaning against what looked like a sandbag wall that had seen better days. Behind them, you could make out the corner of a canvas tent with a red cross painted on the side. And beyond that, the blurred suggestion of a landscape that had been torn apart and was slowly trying to put itself back together. One of the boys was grinning at the camera with that kind of cocky confidence you only see in people who think they're immortal. The kind of smile that says, "Take the picture quick, we've got places to be and things to do." The other was squinting into bright sunlight, more serious, maybe already understanding something his friend hadn't figured out yet. His uniform was rumpled, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of real work, not the kind of soft hands that came from desk jobs. Both were wearing American combat uniforms that had clearly seen action, dirt stains that wouldn't wash out, small tears that had been mended with field repairs snarm. I'm reading. The kind of honest where that came from living outdoors and moving fast when you had to. Trump flipped it over in faded blue ink. Someone had written June 8th, 1944. Me and DJ Normandy. DJ Trump's face went very still. Very still. He looked at the photo again, studying the face of the serious young man. Then he picked up the letter. The handwriting was shaky but determined. The kind you see when someone's hands don't work quite right anymore, but they've got something important to say and they're damn well going to say it. Trump read it silently, his expression changing line by line. First confusion, then something that might have been recognition, then something deeper, something that made him blink twice and take a slow breath. The audience couldn't hear what he was reading, but they could see it hitting him. Whatever was in that letter was rewriting something fundamental. Finally, he looked up. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than anyone had heard it all day. This can't be... From his position against the wall, Warrant Officer Callum Reev answered with the same calm precision he'd shown throughout. He remembered every detail, sir, until the moment he died. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred, the kind that fills churches and cemeteries and hospital rooms where important things are happening. Trump looked down at the letter again, then at the bronze star, then at the photograph of two young men who thought they had all the time in the world. He walked slowly back to the lectern, but instead of returning to his prepared speech, he gently moved his typed pages aside and placed the medal on the wooden surface where everyone could see it. "May I read this?" he asked. He wasn't asking his staff or the protocol officer. He was asking the room, maybe asking the memory of a man who'd waited 79 years to send a message. Callum Reev gave another of those barely perceptible nods. Trump unfolded the letter again, handling it like something that might dissolve if he gripped it too tight. And then in a voice stripped of performance, stripped of politics, stripped of everything except truth, he read, "If you're reading this, then the guard did his job, and I did mine. You may not remember me, but I remember you. You weren't a soldier, but you were there, a volunteer, helping with the wounded near the edge of the line. June 8th, 2 days after the first wave hit the beaches. The room had gone from quiet to absolutely motionless. Even the chandeliers seemed to have stopped swaying. You could feel the collective breath being held, 200 people suddenly understanding they were witnessing something that would stay with them forever. In the third row, a British colonel who'd served in Afghanistan was leaning forward, his jaw tight with recognition. This was the kind of story every soldier knew could happen, but hoped they'd never have to live through. Near the back, an American nurse who'd done 3 tours in Iraq had tears tracking down her cheeks without her seeming to notice. The med tent got shelled. Trump continued reading, his voice steady but softer now, like he was speaking to the ghost of a 19-year-old boy who'd made a choice without thinking about consequences. You ran into the rubble with me to pull out 2 boys I couldn't reach alone. One of them lived, the other didn't. You took shrapnel in your leg. Nothing serious, but it bled like hell. I dragged you out of there and never saw you again. A few people in the audience were leaning forward now, caught up in a story none of them had expected to hear. Someone in the 4th row, an elderly woman wearing a small poppy pin, was pressing a handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with the kind of recognition that comes from hearing echoes of your own wartime memories. Years later, I saw your face in a magazine. I was sure it was you. Then on the news and again, DJ. That's what you told us to call you. I don't know what your life became after that day, but I never forgot what you did. You weren't supposed to be there, but you were, and that meant everything. Trump's voice caught slightly on the next line. I don't need a thank you. I just wanted you to know you mattered even when you didn't know it. The letter was signed. Sergeant Francis Alden, 1st Infantry Division. Trump stood there holding the paper with both hands now, staring at handwriting that had travelled across 8 decades to find him. This I don't. He stopped, collected himself. I was 19. My father had connections, got me a job with the Red Cross. I thought it was supposed to be safe work behind the lines. He looked up at the crowd, but his eyes seemed focused somewhere else entirely, somewhere in 1944. I remember the tent. I remember the shells. I remember thinking we were all going to die. His voice got quieter, but I don't remember Francis Frank. From the back of the room, Callum spoke again. He said, you probably wouldn't. Said trauma has a way of protecting us from the worst memories, but he remembered for both of you. Trump picked up the bronze star, turning it over in his palm. The engraving on the back was still legible. For the man who helped me save others without ever claiming a ribbon, you could hear people breathing. Someone in the third row wiped their eyes with the back of their hand. Trump looked toward Callum, then back at the medal, then at the photograph of two young men who had no idea what their lives would become. 79 years, he said, more to himself than anyone else. He carried this for 79 years. A British colonel in the front row stood up, not at attention, just rising out of respect. Then another officer, then another. Soon half the room was on their feet, but not applauding, just standing. Bearing witness, Trump folded the letter carefully, placed it next to the medal, and looked out over the crowd. Not with his usual commanding presence, but with something much rarer, humility. "I came here to give a speech about sacrifice," he said. "But I think the speech found me instead." He gestured toward the back of the room where Callum stood unchanged, unmoved, exactly as he had been all along. That man could have waited until after the ceremony, could have handed this to an aide, let it get lost in the shuffle, but he didn't. He walked right up here in front of all of you and made sure a promise got kept. Trump picked up his prepared remarks, glanced at them once, then set them aside again. Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones nobody ever knows about. A 19-year-old kid running into a bombed medical tent. A dying man writing a letter to someone who might not even remember him. A guard carrying that letter across an ocean because he gave his word. He paused, looking directly at Callum. "What's your name, Warrant Officer?" "Callum Reev, sir." "How long have you been wearing that uniform?" 17 years, sir." 5 deployments before this posting. Trump nodded slowly. "And today you carried more than just a message, didn't you?" For the first time since he'd moved from his post, something shifted in Callum's expression. Not much, just a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested this moment was hitting him harder than his training usually allowed. He said Callum replied, his voice steady but softer than before, that if I failed to deliver it, the war would end with a lie. That if I succeeded, it would end with truth. An elderly American veteran in the front row closed his eyes and nodded once slowly. A British nurse, probably in her 80s, wearing a Royal Army Medical Corps pin, pressed a tissue to her cheek. Trump walked over to a nearby aide and spoke quietly. The man nodded and produced a small wooden box lined with dark blue velvet. "This letter, this medal, this photograph," Trump said, placing each item carefully in the box. "They don't belong to me. They belong to history, to both our countries, to the idea that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes." He closed the box and held it with both hands. "Warrant Officer Reev, you didn't just deliver a letter today. You delivered a reminder that the most important battles aren't always the ones that make the headlines. Sometimes they're fought by teenagers who just want to help. Sometimes they're won by old men who refuse to let important things be forgotten. And sometimes they're decided by young men who understand that keeping your word isn't just duty, it's sacred." The room was so quiet you could hear the heating system cycling on somewhere in the walls. Trump looked out over the assembled crowd. American generals and British colonels, diplomats and veterans, photographers and aides. And for once in his very public life, he seemed to understand that the moment was bigger than he was. "I don't know what Francis Alden would think of the man I became," he said. "But I know what he thought of the boy I was on one afternoon in France. And maybe that's enough." He handed the box to a British liaison officer who accepted it with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for state gifts. "This goes to the joint archives." Trump said both flags, both countries, so that when people ask what the special relationship really means, they can see it. 2 boys in a photo. One who remembered, one who carried the message, and all of us who got to witness the delivery. From somewhere in the crowd, an American voice called out softly. "Here, here," a British voice echoed. "Quite right." But no one applauded. No one cheered. The moment didn't need celebration. It needed respect. Trump walked back to the lectern one final time. But instead of resuming his speech, he simply said, "I think that's enough talking for today." He stepped away from the microphone, moved past his aides, and walked quietly toward Callum Reev. When he reached the guard, he stopped and looked him directly in the eye. "Thank you," he said, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "for keeping faith with a dying man, for walking into a room full of important people and making sure the most important person was the one who couldn't be here." Callum nodded once. "It was my honor, sir." Trump extended his hand. And Callum, after a moment's hesitation, shook it. Then Trump turned and walked out of the hall, followed by his security detail and staff. No grand exit, no final waves, no attempt to reclaim the spotlight, just a quiet departure that somehow felt more presidential than any podium performance. The box containing Francis Alden's letter, medal, and photograph was transported that afternoon to the Joint Military Archives at the Imperial War Museum. No press release was issued, no photos were taken for publicity, but word spread the way important things do. Quietly from one person to another, veterans calling old friends, officers writing letters home, diplomats mentioning it in dispatches. Within a week, the story had reached retirement homes and VFW halls and regimental clubs across 2 continents. Not as news, but as something more valuable, proof that some things still matter. 3 months later, a small ceremony was held at the museum. Nothing grand, just a few dozen people, mostly old soldiers and their families. The display case was unveiled quietly containing the artifacts alongside a simple plaque in memory of Sergeant Francis Alden, 1st Infantry Division. And all those who understand that the most important promises are the ones we keep for people who can no longer keep them for themselves. Delivered by Warrant Officer Callum Reev, received in silence, remembered forever. Callum was there, of course, not in uniform this time, just a simple dark suit. When someone asked him how it felt to be part of something so significant, he just smiled and said, "I was just the messenger." The message was what mattered. And in the corner of the museum, where afternoon light filters through tall windows and catches the glass of the display case, visitors sometimes pause longer than they plan. They read the letter, study the photograph, look at the small bronze star that somehow seems to hold more weight than objects 10 times its size. Children ask their grandparents what it means. Students on field trips stop taking selfies and start asking questions. Veterans stand quietly, remembering their own moments of choice, their own promises kept or broken. They think about promises kept across decades, about teenage volunteers who ran toward danger when every instinct told them to run away, about old men who refused to let important things die with them. Who carried secrets for 79 years because they understood that some stories are too important to take to the grave. About young guards who understood that duty sometimes means carrying more than you signed up for. Walking into rooms full of powerful people and insisting that the most important person is the one who can't be there. The display case has become an unexpected pilgrimage site, not officially, but in the way that matters most. People come not because they're told to, but because they need to. Because in a world that moves too fast and forgets too quickly, there's something profound about evidence that some people still keep their word. Tour guides have learned to build extra time into their schedules for this stop. They've seen grown men cry reading Francis Alden's letter. They've watched teenagers put away their phones and stand in respectful silence. They've noticed that conversations in the museum are quieter after people visit this particular case, as if the weight of real sacrifice has a way of putting daily complaints into perspective. And maybe, if they're lucky, they walk away understanding something about the difference between demanding respect and earning it, between making noise and making a difference, between being heard and being remembered. They learn that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with patience, with memory, with the simple, radical act of keeping faith with people who can no longer keep faith with themselves. They discover that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a young man stepping forward when protocol says, "Stay back." Sometimes it's an old man writing a letter when his hands can barely hold a pen. Sometimes it's the decision to carry someone else's truth because you understand that some things are bigger than convenience. So here's the question. If someone trusted you with their most important memory, would you have the courage to deliver it? Do you think the moments that matter most are the ones that happen in front of cameras, or the ones that happen when nobody's watching, except the people who need to see? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story reminded you that some things are bigger than politics, bigger than fame, bigger than the noise that fills our daily lives, hit that like button. It genuinely helps. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because we share these stories every day. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when nobody's looking. And if you know someone who could use a reminder about what real leadership looks like, share this with them. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it now and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most powerful moments aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the quietest, and sometimes they're the ones that take 79 years to find their way.